I'm just going to run through how to measure your carbon footprint and some of the options out there. This isn't going to be comprehensive in terms of every option that is possible. These are just the ones that I'm aware of and some broad concepts around it. And the idea here is, firstly, why the benefits of measuring and why would you actually measure your footprint? And there's a few different angles to take here, one of which is providing transparency to your customers on your targets. So if you do have an environmental policy page or anything like that, it's good to include these figures here, which a lot of people don't do, to be honest, and is slightly annoying. Provides a breakdown of where your emissions are. So obviously you've got a clear picture and a map of where you need to tackle them. It gives you accountability of what you're up to. I think one of the major benefits is that it will help highlight opportunities for areas that you can do things better. So although some of these do come with a cost attached to doing the audit or doing the measurement, they will actually lead to cost savings and may even provide a new business model. So sometimes if you flag that a lot of your emissions are in your waste, it might be that waste can then be repurposed as actually being a resource. And certainly there's some companies that have taken things like coffee grinds that were being thrown out before, and they're actually selling those to companies who are reusing it. So there's a circular economy element there, which is worth exploring. It provides measurement, also provides resilience against future taxes or legal requirements. Again, that's all a little bit vague at the minute for smaller companies, but certainly with the TFCD and for larger companies, that's starting to kind of knock down. And also, I think suppliers are going to start asking you for it. And especially, this is what Small 99 is always pushing for, is one of the main things that people ask us is, what can we do? And the main thing we say is, go to your suppliers and start asking them where your emissions are, because the suppliers normally haven't thought about it, and they're going to be your biggest part of your emissions. So I think just having this data there shows a preparedness, even if that data isn't entirely accurate or is, you're still working on it, having something is better than nothing. In terms of when should you measure, there's two schools of thought. And I think there's one which is before you get started and before you do anything. And then there's one which is just get started and then measure as part of this process. So on the one hand, you could start, if you start measuring before you get started, you do get an accurate picture of everything and all of your emissions in the business, which means that you can then demonstrate reductions much more clearly. And that's going to typically look much better as well, and might give you more motivation, because you'll naturally start from a higher point. So if you haven't changed at like renewable energy supplier, for example, that's going to be a very quick reduction in your emissions straight off the bat, which then might keep you motivated and keep the team motivated to keep going. But it also might delay you. And typically with an audit of this, well, depending on what kind of audit you do, but a full comprehensive audit is going to take about 6 months of data to pull together. And those are months that might be lost the way you could actually just be avoiding those emissions. So that's why I tend to lean towards more of the just get started camp and then measure this as part of the ongoing process. You do miss that lack of a breakdown of the progress that you're making, and you don't necessarily have that big juicy figure, which then becomes a smaller figure that you can shout about. But it is more cost effective. It does actually mean that you are reducing your emissions down very quickly. It typically gets your momentum going, because if you're at a point where you're excited about this, it means you can start doing stuff and feel like you're actually making progress rather than just waiting on a kind of compliance or a consultant to do stuff. So I think there's no right or wrong answer here, I don't think. I think it is just depending on what's right for you. In terms of what do you measure, just to roughly gloss over the scope 3 emissions. So you've got scope 1, which is your created emissions, anything from your vehicles that you're driving, any on-site activity. So if you've got air conditioning that's leaking, or you're making cement, or you're driving a lot of vehicles. You've got your consumed emissions, which are energy bills and purchase energy. So that's basically your energy bills. And then you've got scope 3, which is everything else. And this is why the suppliers and the collaboration with your suppliers is so important, because that scope 3 emission is typically going to be 90% of your emissions. Just to give some examples of that, I think H&M, Starbucks and Lidl, if you look at their footprint, and they've gone through this entire process fully, their scope 3 was about 96 to 98% of their total emissions. So it's a huge element here, where even these massive companies who have got property and leasing and stuff, it's still all their suppliers, which are the main reasons for their emissions. So what are we measuring the emissions in? And that is carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e. This is a little figure you'll see quite often around. We use it in our articles, and it might pop up here and there. And the reason for that is it's a baseline metric of the global warming potential of all other greenhouse gases, because the greenhouse gases aren't all equal. Carbon dioxide has a global warming potential of 1. Methane is 28. Nitrous oxide is 265. And then there's a chart of about 20 other minor gases in that, which all have slightly different impacts in terms of their warming potential. So that's why we use the CO2e figure, because that will take into account if you are, producing methane from agriculture, or if you are doing it from nitrous oxide from driving, etc. It just bundles it into one comparable figure that we can then use as a metric. In terms of how often you should measure, I think there's, again, two approaches here. One, I think, is definitely do it at least yearly so that you can audit it and treat it as a tax assessment, or like a revenue type breakdown where you want to tie it to those KPIs. But also, ideally, we want to try and do this monthly, because you want to try and build in decision-making on your carbon emissions to a consistent and fluid basis. That's much easier said than done, though. So I think that's the goal, and the aim point is to try and do it monthly, but at the minute that is going to be quite a difficult thing to do. But also I think that the tax example does hold up here quite easily, where you know roughly your revenue month to month, but you don't know it entirely accurately. But at the end of the year, you would then do that full assessment, which is the more accurate one. So, right, in terms of the different ways to measure, there are 3 broad ones I'm going to go over. So one is templated guidance, which is basically what Small 99 are doing at the minute, where we don't actually do anything with your business. We give you broad advice based on what other companies have done. So companies who have gone through this process will have learned something. We then template that knowledge up into bundles that is slightly more accessible for people who don't want to necessarily go that full way and do that full audit yet. There's also then, in terms of the actual measurement of your carbon footprint, the spend-based, where a company will take your revenue and your spending, and then based on that, apply some averages to it and multiply it out to get some general trends and some quite quick and dirty carbon emissions figures. And then finally, there's the activity method. And this is what most people will be thinking of when you say measure your carbon footprint, where it is a consultant who'll come into your company, gather all the data up, ask you lots of questions, and then pull up a full audit based on your day-to-day activities in your business. So what does a month look like in your business? And then really pull that down into all the base elements. The way I tend to think of this carbon footprint measurement approach is that it is a journey. This isn't a binary thing. You've got the end goal, which is having 100% knowledge over everything that you can actually do. And you're probably at 0.0 at the minute, where you don't have any clue of what's going on, which is fair enough. So there's 2 schools of thought, I think. You can either go from 0 to 100% accurate, where you get a consultant in and they do the full audit. And that's quite a leap to make, I think, because that's quite expensive. And just as with any consultant, people probably aren't quite ready to buy that yet. You're not quite ready to take that information because you don't understand the value that it's going to bring to your business. And therefore, there is the second school of thought, which I, again, tend to fall into slightly more, where we want to break this down into a series of smaller steps, where you go from 0 to maybe 60% knowledge, to then 80% knowledge, to then 100% knowledge. Those are made up figures, but the idea being that you're going from no knowledge to a little bit of knowledge to more knowledge to then full knowledge. Again, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. It is just what's most appropriate to you. If you've got the money and you've got the willingness to go and get a full audit done, absolutely go for it. However, I think for a lot of business owners, that might be a bit of a leap to make, and it might be a bit scary. So there's also no reason why not to just break it down into smaller steps and graduate towards that final goal. So in terms of free tools that are out there, there's 3 main ones. There is, of course, Small 99's Carbon Impact Tool, which is our non-technical. It doesn't ask you for any data. We do try and cover scopes 1, 2, and 3. It's not perfect at all. There's questions in there I need to change, but the idea is it gives you a very quick 5-minute prompt on areas of your business where the carbon might be sat based on just broad trends. Then there's 3 other ones that are all quite similar. So you've got the Carbon Trust. I've got one for small businesses, but it does only cover scope 1 and 2. It requires you to enter all your data around mileages, fuel use, etc. Carbon Footprint have also got one that is either free or then you can pay for. I'm not sure if the paid one then includes scope 3 emissions or whether it's just slightly more for slightly larger companies. But again, it's limited in the amount of scopes it measures. I think it is only scopes 1 and 2 for the free version. And then also you've got the Carbon Fund, which have a similar one, but again, it's focusing on transport and energy, so scopes 1 and 2. And this is the most common theme I find with a lot of these free tools, is that they're only measuring, they are very basic calculators where you put in figures of the miles driven, miles flown, how much energy you're using, and then it will just produce a report out the back of that. So fairly limited in use, I think, considering that scope 3 emissions are going to be 98% of your emissions. So why use the free ones? I think the benefits are they are low risk. They get you thinking about where your emissions are and some initial figures to play with, and starts that journey. It might raise some questions that you hadn't thought of, but they do tend to be quite time consuming. So all the carbon trust ones, they are, that's a couple of hours of work to sit down and go through those, I think, in terms of gathering the data up. And they are limited in scope, and they're only going to give you a certain amount of information, which, to be honest, you probably know anyway, because you will be looking at how many miles you're driving and how much energy you're using from a cost basis. So that's a metric you've got already. And the less you drive, the less gas you use, the more money you're going to save. So I'm not sure how useful they are necessarily in getting you started if you've already got a good handle from that perspective. Next one to look at are software. So these are the ones that I'd say are 60 to 80% accurate. One of my favorite ones that I've recently discovered, and it's a startup based in Brighton, is called Ditch Carbon. So what Ditch Carbon do is they'll take your accounts data. So you export a CSV file from your like Xero or from Sage or whoever, and then import it into Ditch Carbon, who will then run their software over it and group together your emissions based on some data that they're applying to it. I don't really know how they're doing it necessarily, and I think this is something that's always changing because they've got databases of different suppliers and carbon emissions that they're working with. So it's always going to improve over time as their data improves. But the benefit is it gives you a really quick, fast, and affordable breakdown of your scope 3 emissions, as well as your scope 1 and 2. But it's plugging into an existing system. This doesn't require you to go and get any new data necessarily. This is data that will probably sit in your system already. You just need to export it as a CSV and import it. And it will give you then a dashboard and some nice graphs and some really quick, simple prompts on areas you need to start fixing. And it gives you that tracking month on month, and it gives you a dashboard as well. So it's a really interesting one. It's not going to be 100% accurate, but I think it's a really good starting point. It is a monthly subscription, so I think it's about 20, 30 quid a month. And it does depend on their data. So there is limitations there, but as a starting point, I think it's a really strong one. There's a couple of other accounts-based ones as well. There's CBN Expert, which are based up in Scotland, which again, they give you a visual dashboard. It's slightly more refined software, connects you with partners to help find those solutions. It is affordable. So again, I think it's about 15, 20 pounds a month. And it is monthly tracking, so you can make KPIs and decisions on an ongoing basis with it. The downside with CBN Expert is it does require manual input. It doesn't take in like an export or an import. You have to sit down and manually enter in all that data that you're looking at, which I sort of think that if you've already got to the point of creating a spreadsheet and putting all that data together, you might as well just use that spreadsheet. I'm not sure what the benefit is from then entering it in somewhere else. You are reliant on their data and their software to then measure stuff out, and it is a monthly commitment to that data. Compare Your Footprint, they also have a pretty good piece of software that's only £8 a month, and it depends on the actual level of revenue that you're based on. It tracks it against industry benchmarks, which I think is the main thing that stands out against other software, is that because they've got more data sets, because they've been going for about 10, 15 years, you can start seeing where you compare it to the average for your industry. So it's really good for highlighting whether you're good or bad. And they do offer a consultancy service as well, so then you can upgrade that if needed. The downside again is it's a little bit clunkier software. It's not as smooth as I'd like. It's still quite time consuming because it requires manual entry. So those are the limitations mostly with these software, is that it sometimes does require manual entry, whereas the accounts based, I think the reason why I like it so much is that it's quite quick. Within an hour or so, you can probably get quite a good quick impact of what you're doing. Consultants. So just broadly, because there are quite a few out there, they are going to be 100% accurate. They're going to spend a lot of time to go through your business and understand exactly what you're doing. You get full tracking with that, so they'll be able to produce a very nice dashboard And I think it's similar to an accountant doing your year-end accounts. They're going to take time to do it. They'll do it properly. You'll get a lot of breakdown for it. Quite often they'll tie in accreditations to that as well. So you get a bit more of a stamp of approval to say that it's been verified and it's accurate. The downside of these are that typically, just from a couple I've spoken to, it will take around 6 months to get all the data that you need for that, just because there's going to be a lot of questions and a lot of digging in they need to do. That's dead time that you could be meant to spend making progress instead. So I'm always of the opinion that it's sometimes better to start and then get the consultants involved after 6 months of just eliminating the easy stuff that you already know and that you can get on with, just for the sake of progress, really. In terms of costs, they're going to cost, I don't think they're going to be anyone less than £1,000. It's going to be a couple of grand at best. So it's about being ready for that as well in terms of your business. In terms of individual companies that I've worked with, I think C3 are really good for smaller companies. They're very affordable. They're a smaller outfit. It's just 2 guys. They really know. They're very hot on this sector. I chat to them quite a lot. They manage the entire process. So they'll manage your offsets for you as well, and identify your reduction areas and help you with those. And it is a done for you service, so you don't really have to do much other than give them the data when they ask for it. The only downside for them is they do tend to deal with smaller companies, so they're not necessarily appropriate for corporate clients or anything like that. And that's where I'd probably refer instead to Green Element, who are the company behind the Compare Your Footprint tool, where they are probably more expensive, but they are more suited, I think, to larger teams and larger companies. They've been in it for longer. They've probably got a better experience in different industries, so might be able to, again, provide that comparison against other industry benchmarks to get an idea of where you're at. Just a very brief example of a couple of startups we're starting to see that are more industry specific as well. Again, this isn't comprehensive, but it's quite interesting that there's 2 software companies now that I've seen come through. These aren't ones I've hunted out, I've just come across them, but there's My Emissions, which do carbon labeling for restaurants. So really interesting in that if you went into a restaurant and you have a food menu, they might be able to then attach a carbon footprint equivalent figure to every meal or to different parts of that menu. So then you can start seeing, as a restaurant owner, where your emissions are from a customer point of view, as well as an operations point of view. So they're much more on that customer front end. The reason why I'm mentioning these is I think they're going to be different examples of this for different industries. This isn't necessarily because anyone watching this is in the restaurant sector, but there'll be companies out there like this that are starting up doing really interesting stuff. Another one is Rewild. So they're currently just updating the website, but they also track the emissions only of restaurants. So they will look at it from a business perspective and giving business owners the carbon footprint total of their business rather than the actual individual meals. So again, it's a bit more top level, and they will help you offset that accordingly and give you much more tracking. So I think it's worth having a look out there in your industry specifically to see if there are any solutions that are slightly more specific. Certainly I'm always on the hunt for them, so please let me know if you find any. In terms of the accreditations, just to run through very quickly, this is the slightly more boring section, but there's a lot of different frameworks out there which people are using to measure these against. So I just wanted to run through and let you know which ones are the best for this. There's the Carbon Trust, and they will deliver the accreditation as part of that audit, and that's more of an organizational standard. And again, there are going to be industry specific standards here as well. So I know that the airport carbon accreditation exists, which is a bit of a weird one because airports are, the worst business for carbon footprints. And then the building industry and the restaurant industry also will have their own specifics. There's loads of organizations out there, so I don't want to go into all of them, but there will be industry specific bodies that do slightly more niche accreditation audits as part of that. And Spill 99, we might do it at some point in the future as well. The main thing you want to look out for when you're talking to any consultant or any software is the greenhouse gas protocol. They are the people who designed the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. They designed and measure a lot of the CO2e equivalents and all that data. So they are, the people to trust in this area. Just make sure that they are mentioned when you're looking at stuff. You want that stamp of approval. You want that logo on the work. Another thing that you might see popping around is the ISO 14001, I'm not sure, which is one of the toughest and broadest ranging environmental management standards. So it goes slightly beyond just net zero and carbon Offsetting, not carbon offsetting, carbon footprint measurement. It's an ISO, it's a family of ISO standards, so it's quite a few different ones here, but it is one that I've seen pop up quite a few times in consultants when they're mentioning it. It's just worth bearing in mind that this is, again, it's a very tough set of standards to try and compete with or to try and get accredited with. So if you see this somewhere, it's probably quite a good sign on their offering. At product level, so if you're looking at doing a footprint of your actual individual products, there is the PAS 2050 life cycle assessment, which again is the main industry standard for things like, okay, how much does this pack of hand cream, what is the carbon footprint of that? Or, you know, what is this water bottle? That's what they, you know, the PAS 2050 was developed by the GHD to provide a bit more of a framework for individual products rather than businesses. So it depends what level you want to go to, but it's something to also consider. And I think we'll see more of this as people are developing these carbon-friendly, eco-friendly products. And certainly I'd like to see it a lot more, because to be honest, a lot of the time eco-friendly products aren't carbon-friendly. They actually have higher footprints than the plastic alternatives, which is a whole separate thing. But yeah, individual product assessments, is worth knowing it's there. So in terms of, once you've gone through this process and you have a carbon budget and you've measured it and you've got this idea of a footprint, what do you do with it now? I just wanted to run through the importance of thinking of the CO2 in your business as a finite resource and really thinking of it as a carbon budget rather than as a footprint. So this is what it might currently look like in your business, where you've got 20 tons of CO2e per year that you're emitting, and it's broken down into suppliers, packaging, electricity, vehicle costs, your personal travel, work travel, and then the waste management as well. Ideally, what you want to do is then assess this and start looking at areas to reduce it down and go, okay, so we've got 20 tons now. We're going to reduce that budget down to 10 tons. So we need to only be spending 10 tons of CO2e. What does that look like? And that might be that then you actually really ring fence your travel because you need to do it. You can't yet get an electric vehicle because of reasons, or you need to have, you know, diesel vans running just because of the size of product. And therefore that is the main majority of where your emissions are going to be ring fenced and spent. Is in your travel, and then you're going to reduce down the emissions elsewhere to protect that. So then you reduce that down, the electricity you're using, the packaging you're using, you work with better suppliers who are producing less, and you just start reducing down budgets elsewhere to try and protect it. So this is how I recommend you start thinking about it, because this fits into the existing model of revenue, basically, in how business owners think about it. And I think it's a much simpler and clearer way to think of it that is slightly less nebulous than just emissions as a thing. So hopefully that's helpful. So what do you do now? I think my first point of call would probably to start our impact assessment. And I know a lot of you already have done that, but I think that will probably flag up a few questions or a few ideas that you maybe haven't thought of yet, and certainly give you some of those easy wins to get started. If you do have accountancy software, that will be my next port of call, because you can export that and then just go to Ditch Carbon and then import it to them. And that will again give you the second next step of a fair bit of top level data to get started with. And then after that, I think if you are ready to go and get a full audit, or certainly if you've made quite a lot of reductions already, and now you're kind of hitting a point where you don't really know where the next stage is, then I would go and get a consultant or someone in to do a more detailed audit. But I think there's a lot of stuff you can do before that. And now, any questions?